Hey YouTube, it's Jordan with Studio GBK, and today I take some Claro Walnut, add in some black epoxy, and turn it all into a live edge table that came out pretty nice. There were some accidents, but I managed to get it all figured out. Now, I originally got both of these slabs on Facebook Marketplace for $80, which is a pretty good price for walnut. I took some measurements to figure out how big I want the table to be, and also made sure that the base would fit. And from there, I made a mold and cut the slabs down to the perfect size that would fit inside that mold. Now, my idea here was to create a rectangular shaped coffee table with sharp square edges around the perimeter, contrasting with live edge designs in the middle. And while I was cleaning off the edges of these slabs with a wire wheel, I noticed that these slabs were slightly twisted and warped. So I made a router sled in an attempt to flatten them. A router sled is basically like a poor man's CNC machine, I guess, and it might look smooth sailing in these shots, but my first time ever using one of these, here's what happened. Yeah, not as smooth as I would have liked. And I took that personally and learned to tighten the router bit properly, but I still cut my finger open and also cut way too deep into the slab in some areas. So this router sled thing was like a combo deal of bad events, and I ended up just flattening these with a commercial planer and won't be using a router sled in the future. So once I got these flat, I sealed them with art resin to protect them from warping again once the table is built. That resin basically coats the wood with a protective layer of epoxy that doesn't allow temperature or humidity to affect the wood later. I let that resin soak into the wood, giving it about 3 days to dry, and then I cover the inside of that mold with tuck tape, which prevents the epoxy from bonding to the mold and allows me to separate the table much easier once I'm peeling that mold off. Some people use mold release spray as well, but in my experience, tuck tape has always been enough. From here, I'm ready to pour this table, so I poured my two-part epoxy mixture in the bucket and colored it with this liquid dye. Walnut has lots of natural dark accents, which will match nicely with this color. I stirred it up really well and came back with the torch to pop as many bubbles as I can. And I'm not actually touching the epoxy with this torch because that will burn it. I keep the torch a few inches away from it and let the CO2 and heat pop the bubbles, not the actual flame. And I'm taking a major risk here using art resin because I checked their website and it's only designed to be poured up to 1/8 of an inch thick. And I really wish I knew that back when I ordered 10 gallons of it for close to $800. But now that I have so much of it, I can't just let it go to waste. It's actually worked for me on some other deep pour projects, but it's also ruined some projects as well.
Emotional damage.
So I was a little nervous about this as I went into pouring it. And because of that, I start off with a thin layer, just playing it safe, thinking to maybe pour an inch at a time. And I put a level on the form to make sure this epoxy dries as evenly as possible. I take these shims and got it to where I want it. And I had so much epoxy left in the bucket, I just decided to pour the whole thing at once. And here's what it looked like when I was done. I didn't mean to drown it in epoxy like that, but that's how it went. I use these clamps to hold the slabs in place. Wood usually moves and floats in the epoxy when it's not secured. I put a fan blowing over it to prevent it from overheating or cracking. And then I let it dry for about 3 days, and it actually did not crack. Super happy about that. And then I came back to remove it from the form. I removed all the clamps, and some of the red pads got stuck and had to be pried out. When it's soft like this, that means it hasn't fully cured, so it wasn't too hard to get these out. After that, I remove all the screws one by one, making sure I don't miss any of them, and I continue separating this mold from the table that's now dried inside of it. The sides didn't give me too much trouble and came off pretty easily. I used a mallet and pry bar to peel off the wood, but when I got to the bottom, it was much more difficult, and I ended up having to smack in a bunch of pry bars in between the table and the mold to get enough space to separate it. But I eventually got that off smoothly as well and was able to peel it from that bottom piece of melamine there. From there, I took it over to Ponderosa Millworks, which is a generous wood shop that allows me to use their wide belt sander by the hour. It's basically like a giant planer, and a machine of that size can cost anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000. So I'm grateful I can just rent one when I need it without making that big of an investment. Maybe someday I will. And after a few passes through that sander, I was able to get it nice and flat, along with starting to reveal that book match design that I'm going for. After that, I took it back to my shop to begin the sanding process. As you can see, it has these lines running across it from the wide belt sander. So the first step was to sand all of these off using 100 grit sandpaper to speed up the process. This part is pretty tedious, and it took me probably a good hour and a half just to get the lines removed. But once they were gone, I started to see this table coming together. The next step is getting this table perfectly square. As you can see, the edges of this table aren't quite perfect after being removed from the mold, so I will fix that issue using my skill saw and some straight edges. The first thing I have to do is get one side perfectly straight, and then I can move on from there. So I put my T-square on the straightest edge that I can find and draw a straight line with my pencil all the way across. And to cut perfectly along that line with my skill saw, I have to clamp a straight edge exactly where it needs to be, or the blade can wobble and I won't have that straight edge that I'm going for. So I put the skill saw on the table, lining that blade up exactly where I want it to cut, and I make a line exactly where the edge of that metal blade guard is. And the distance between the two is about 3.5 inches, as you can see here. So I make 2 marks off of the line that I'll be cutting at 3.5 inches, and then line up my straight edge right up to both of those lines that I've made and clamp it down so that it can't move. And in theory, this should give me a perfectly straight line. I come through and cut that side, making sure to keep my skill saw as flat on the table and the straight edge as possible. And that one cut came out pretty straight. Now that I have one side that's perfectly straight, I take my framing square, line it up with the straight edge that I've just cut, and this will give me a perfect 90-degree angle and make a nice sharp edge that I'm going for. I marked that with my pencil and extended that line all the way up the longer side of the table with my 9-foot level that I also use as a straight edge. I cut along that line and basically used this method to go all the way around the table until I got it perfectly squared. I did notice some micro pits and small holes in the table, which is pretty common. After planing a table, the epoxy settles into the cracks, which leaves these little voids. And I just filled the bigger ones with the same epoxy that I poured the table with. And for the smaller holes, I filled them with CA glue and sprayed them with an activator to harden it. I scraped off the excess epoxy with a flat blade in some areas, and the rest of it I just sanded. And once I got those holes taken care of, I came back with my router and an 1/8 inch chamfer bit to round off the edges evenly. Now, routers aren't my best friend, as I explained earlier in the video, but we're working on it. And this router / chamfering process actually went pretty smooth. Now, I usually finish my pieces with oils, walrus oil, things like that. But today I decided to try a clear coat on this table for the first time. So I watched a bunch of clear coat videos on YouTube and still didn't really know what I was doing because it was my first time, but I did my best. As you can see, I started with a layer that's way too thin to be a final clear coat, but the goal is to seal the surface of this table and prevent bubbles from coming up when I apply that final coat, or the flood coat as they call it. I sanded that first layer nice and smooth and used these notch trowels to spread that final flood coat to the surface of the table. I actually didn't mix enough to cover the whole thing, so I scrambled to mix up enough at the last second. And once I spread that all around, I came back with a torch to pop all the bubbles. And again, I'm not touching the flame to the epoxy, I'm just keeping it a few inches away. And in some areas, I had these annoying bubbles that just kept coming and coming. I stayed there with the torch for about an hour, and they disappear for a couple seconds, and they reappear, which kind of drove me crazy. It reminds me of that alligator game I used to play at Chuck E. Cheese as a kid, and I was really good at that game, but at this point I wasn't feeling like the best clear coater in the world. but after fighting those bubbles for an hour, I had to leave and let the clear coat dry. I came back the next day, and I must say it looked pretty good for my first clear coat ever. There were some small imperfections from dust and whatever else I got in the clear coat. I tried to sand and buff that out, and that only did so much. I will try this again in a special room with no dust, and feel free to leave any tips or suggestions in the comments. Overall, I was actually pleased with how this one turned out, and I appreciate all the positive feedback in my Instagram comments. That's it for this video, and I'll see you all in the next one.